Hi everyone and welcome to another video. You might have heard before that most aircraft accidents happen just after takeoff or before landing. This is also the case for today's report, which will be about Crossair 3597, an accident that happened in Switzerland about 20 years ago. Today we are going to take a look at a crash that happened because of gross negligence. If you liked the video, please subscribe for weekly aviation videos. Welcome to Airspace. On November 2001, Crossair Flight 3597 took off in Berlin for its 1-hour flight to Zurich, Switzerland. While many of you may have never heard of Crossair, it was one of the largest regional carriers in Switzerland around the turn of the millennium. Since 1991, it had belonged to Swissair. On this cold November evening, the flight deck was occupied by a very experienced captain with almost 20,000 flight hours under his belt. He was not far away from retirement. His co-pilot meanwhile was very young and in his first year on the job after pilot school with just under 500 hours of experience. Shortly before 10 o'clock in the evening, the crew started their descent to Zurich, expecting runway 14 for the approach, which features an instrument landing system that makes approaches easier for crews since it provides both vertical and horizontal guidance. One can imagine it like a beam that leads to the runway at an angle. Meanwhile, Zurich Airport switched its operating concept. That means air traffic control redefined which runways are used for takeoff and for landing. Due to a noise abatement restriction, runway 14 could not be used after 10 o'clock, and now planes had to land on runway 28. This runway is shorter and did not have an instrument landing system installed back in 2001. Instead, a so-called non-precision approach had to be executed. GPS was not used widely back then. In order to execute such a non-precision approach, one can use the navigation beacon that is installed in the middle of the airport and select a radial, that is a direction beam, on which one can approach the airport. Vertical guidance is not provided, but one can measure the distance to the navigation beacon. Therefore, the descent is planned according to given distances, translated into altitudes at these points. In the end, one must level off the plane at the last safe altitude, the minimum descent altitude. At this altitude, the plane may fly towards the airport, and if visual contact to the runway or the approach lights is established, the final part of the approach and the landing is executed solely by relying on visual references. After the crew received the news about the runway change, the first officer copied the latest weather and runway report and relayed this info to the captain, which then commenced to lecture the first officer on how to correctly interpret such a runway report, even though the first officer had done so correctly. He also briefed the first officer on how he would fly the approach. Meanwhile, light snow had started and the visibility around the airport reduced gradually, as it often does around that time of year in Zurich. The crew started their approach at 4,000 feet and 8 nautical miles from the navigation aid, as per procedure. The rate of descent was set at 1,200 feet per minute, which is rather high for the approach. Nevertheless, it passed the checkpoint at 6 nautical miles, almost at the correct altitude. Their next and last checkpoint would have been an altitude of 2,390 feet, the minimum descent altitude. For some reason, the captain announced that he was descending further, as he had visual contact to the ground but not with the runway. This alone is a case of gross negligence, as a descent below the minimum descent altitude is prohibited if the runway or its approach lights cannot be seen. The co-pilot did not intervene. The plane descended to 2,000 feet, where the captain eventually leveled the plane off. A few seconds later, he pondered aloud whether he should maybe go around, and 2 seconds later he pushed the thrust levers fully forward to initiate the procedure, but it was already too late. The aircraft impacted the tops of several trees and subsequently crashed into a hillside, 4 kilometers short of runway 28 in the town of Bassersdorf. I have lived just next to the accident site for a few years. Even today, you can still see some of the missing vegetation where the plane came down in 2001. The investigation that followed took a close look at the history of the captain and the first officer. While the first officer was young and inexperienced, he had completed his training with good grades and was described as lively and benevolent. It remained unclear why he did not intervene when the captain started to deviate below the minimum safe altitude. What the investigation found out about the captain, on the other hand, was very concerning. At age 17, he applied for his first pilot training and was rejected after he failed the entry exam. Nevertheless, he managed to acquire a private pilot's license elsewhere. Later, he tried to obtain a license for flying planes only by reference to instruments, the so-called instrument rating. He failed multiple times, but obtained the license eventually after 3 years. Normally, this is achieved in just a few weeks or months. His further career was tainted by multiple failed conversions to other aircraft types, some of which he eventually passed by a small margin. Most notable were his multiple attempts to obtain a type rating for the McDonnell Douglas MD-80. He failed the conversion course twice, mostly because he struggled to comprehend the plane's navigation systems. In the end, he was requalified to the smaller aircraft he was used to fly before, the Saab 340. But in the year 2000, the Saab was decommissioned by Crossair and an alternative aircraft type for the captain was sought. He reapplied for the MD-80 for a third time, but got rejected. Instead, management decided to train him on the Avro RJ100, the plane type he eventually crashed with. The relative simplicity of this aircraft was stated as a reason for the management's decision. The investigation also found a few other oddities in the captain's career. In 1990, he led a discussion with the first officer on whether the landing gear could be retracted while on ground. While this is impossible in most aircraft types, on the type they were on in that day, it was indeed possible. The captain moved the landing gear lever to the up position in the stationary aircraft, and the landing gear started to retract. The aircraft impacted the ground and had to be written off since it was damaged beyond economic repair. In the advent of this occurrence, he was demoted from instructor to captain. A year later, one of his recurrent check flights was aborted since he did not comply with speed restrictions from air traffic control and failed to observe standard procedures as he performed a landing while a cabin attendant was still standing. And ultimately, there was his infamous sightseeing flight, where he intended to fly to the Swiss airport of Sion with passengers, but unknowingly entered a wrong valley and ended up in Aosta, Italy. He started to approach the airport without radio contact and only aborted his approach when passengers informed him that they were seeing Italian-looking road signs down below. In the end, the investigation concluded that gross negligence on the captain's part was to blame for the accident. His intentional violation of standard procedure while descending through the minimum descent altitude on approach was inexcusable, and in the end it was a deadly decision. Also, the investigation stated that the accident could have been avoided had the first officer fulfilled his duties and intervened when the captain violated standard procedure. Why he did not do so remains unclear. Maybe he felt a large gap in authority between him and the very calm and senior captain. Poor performance monitoring was also attributed to the cause. How a pilot with such a bad performance record could remain employed by Crossair for 2 decades is a mystery. Swissair, who owned Crossair at the time, went bankrupt in the end of 2001. In the aftermath, Switzerland's government decided that the country still needed an airline, and subsequently, Crossair was renamed to Swiss International Airlines, and emergency funding was provided. The company was completely restructured and adopted many planes from the now defunct Swissair. The young company had a few growing pains in its early years, but became the large and renowned airline that it is today. It is known for its high standards in service, product, and crew training. Thank you very much for watching. Today's video was about the lesser known airline. Next week I will talk about a much more famous case in aviation accident history. If you liked the video, please subscribe if you think I earned it. See you in the next one.